Okay, I think we're going to start now. And I want to welcome everybody for being here, for joining us today in this webinar. This is the fourth webinar in the Cancer series. And for those who are not familiar with the Cancer initiative, I will describe briefly what the initiative is about. But welcome to today's webinar to listen from our two experts. First of all, and highly important, I'm going to do the lack of acknowledgement because we respectfully acknowledge the space that Cancor is headquartered in as the traditional territories of 3D7, comprising the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai nations, the Stoney Nakoda nations, Goodstoney, Chiniki, and Bearspaw First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina nations. And these lands are also home of the Otipimswak, Meti government, District 5 and 6, yes, 5 and 6. And these acknowledgements are some of the beginning steps on a journey of several generations. We share them in the spirit of truth, justice, reconciliation, and to contribute to a more equitable and inclusive future for all society. Personally, I'm joining from the ancestral territories of the nations, Treaty 13, here in Toronto. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with the Cancer Initiative, this is a multi-organization project that aims to assess the potential of carbon dioxide removal technologies to meet Canada's 2050 net zero goal and to identify policy options that could enable sustainable, equitable, and rapid deployment of CDR. This is led by the University of Calgary, but includes experts from other academic institutions like the two you will hear from today, the University of Calgary and the Pembina Institute, and the University of Alberta, Simon Fraser University, and the University of Toronto. This is a great initiative, and the coolest thing about the Cancer project is the breadth of disciplines it encompasses, because it goes from chemical engineer, civil engineer, geography, but also to law, economics, and the political science, even from history, which is what we are going to hear from today. This allows us to take on, see new perspectives on CDR development and hear from different disciplines from what they have to say. Overall, there are 25 faculty and staff involved, 30 graduate, postdocs, and summer students. And this is all thanks to the support of the Environment and Climate Change Canada and Natural Resources Canada. Okay, let's get started. But first of all, I wanted to let you guys know that if you have any question, please place it in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them at the end. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some space for questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce then to our two experts who we are going to be hearing from, Dr. Petra Dolata and Dr. Mack Penner. Dr. Petra is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Calgary. She is a former Canada Research Chair, Tier 2, in the history of energy. Her research focuses on the history of energy transitions, the 1970s energy crisis, and the intersection between deindustrialization and energy histories. Dr. Mack Penner is a postdoctoral fellow in the history of energy transitions at the University of Calgary. He is also an editor at Active History and a board member at the University of Alberta's Parkland Institute. Mack is a historian of 20th and 21st century Canada who studies politics, ideas, and the linked histories of ideology and energy in Alberta. So with that, I'll pass it on to Dr. Petra.
Thank you, Luisa, for the introduction, and good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are and listening to us today. So I will start talking about CDR and the humanities in a bit of a broader way, and then Mack will talk you through a particular specific case study. So one of the things that we hear a lot about CDR, whether it's the IPCC or other authors, is that the social acceptance of climate change intervention is essential for their successful deployment. And this is where we come in, because this is where the humanities can prove very useful, because they focus on the human and the everyday experience. We analyze and explain narratives and discourses that filter into the way that people make sense of new technologies. The humanities help us understand cultural differences and worldviews. They can also support the textual framing of complex and fragmented technologies. And last but not least, they give us the language which help us imagine and envision our energy and climate futures. And all of these really help us address the three aspects that I want to talk about in a bit more detail. That is the question of social license or public acceptance, the importance of language, so words do matter, and also the significance of temporality. And that's something, of course, that history brings to the table as one of the main humanities disciplines. So if we can move on to the next slide. Could we please, thank you. So here's a quote by communication scholars, Bellamy and Raimi, who talked about how for those engrossed in carbon removal debates, it is easy to forget that most people have never heard of these strategies. This means that unlike concepts like climate change, for which people already have clear mental models and opinions, carbon removal is still a blank slate. Public perception of carbon removal is therefore particularly sensitive to framings, the ways in which scientists, entrepreneurs, activists, politicians, the media, and others choose to organize and communicate information about it. And you may say this is from 2023, but we still see that there's a lot of unknowns and not really the kind of knowledge that we would hope would be there for CDR. So this leads us to two questions that the humanities can help address. The first one is, what do people actually know and how do they make sense of CDR? And how do we talk about CDR? And answers to both of these questions are important in understanding and potentially achieving public acceptance of CDR technologies. So they're not just some interests that we as researchers and the humanities have, but something that we can contribute. So first of all, there are, of course, varying challenges to public acceptance, including that CDR is still often an unknown technology, that the social and environmental costs remain undefined, and that economic and governance structures are only evolving. And as a consequence, we do not know in detail how the public makes sense of these technologies and what would make CDR deployment fair and acceptable, for example. Thus, we need researchers like anthropologists who talk to people on the ground in an upstream iterative engagement, so starting at the research phase, using a transdisciplinary approach to understand, for example, the significance of place in place-based CDR technologies, because place provides communities and individuals with sense of belonging, value, and meaning. And only then can we comprehend the potential impact of deployment of, for example, place-based CDR. And this is why some authors highlight the importance of deliberative approaches, especially while still forming an opinion on these technologies. Which brings us to the other, probably more important point, which was highlighted by the quote, and that is, due to the lack of knowledge, the public's views are malleable and sensitive to framing. And what does that mean? Projects like ours are then also about engaging in framing that technology. not necessarily us controlling the communications about them, but the way that we talk about what we do with our research, we actually create meaning for the public. So it is also an opportunity because, of course, perceptions of new technologies, and this is what research has shown, are not yet strongly aligned with, for example, political partisanship. So much depends on how we frame the technology and who does the framing, whether it's the scientists, government, or companies. And we know that it matters because the public trusts scientists when it's about research. It actually trusts corporate actors more when it's about deployment. As Mack will discuss in more detail, technologies are always social and embedded in what we call social technical systems. That means that society makes sense of technologies based on their affective, emotional, and also cultural responses, which are often localized and place based. They're also based on worldviews and social identity, including categories of class, gender, ethnicity, age, and others. In fact, social processes combine with individual behavioral decision frameworks to make sense of new technologies. Recent studies, for example, show how acceptance of CDR differs between men and women, between different generations, or between global south and global north. And this cannot easily be established through rational actor models. And this is where the methods of the humanities come in, because we are much more interpretive. We are analytical, but not necessarily in an explanatory way. So we can add important insights to the often quantitative observations of our colleagues, for example, in the social sciences. So it helps us integrate emotional responses to new technologies, which we know are there, including things like hope or fear. It also helps if we understand the history and culture of specific communities, as this will aid us in predicting specific ethical and moral concerns about the burden and fairness of CDR deployment. Acknowledging the importance of this situated cultural knowledge of climate change, for example, will help us understand how perceptions of CDR are formed. And this really brings us to these concerns around moral hazard, crowding out, greenwashing or mitigation deterrence. And finally, history in particular highlights what we call contingency, complexity, and nuance. It really helps us see historically formed cultural differences, and they are often formed over a long period of time. And that helps us understand why empirical studies, for example, show different responses to learning more about CDR. In the US, that learning diminished the understanding of the threat to climate change. In Germany, it increased support for mitigation. And in the UK, it showed no effects. So these are examples where a historical or cultural approach helps us understand a little bit more. Research has shown then that knowledge and trust are important prerequisites for acceptance of CDR technologies. But the question for us as researchers is, how do we then convey information about new and emerging technology in a neutral and balanced way without using existing frames which may actually not be useful? So do we, for example, describe DACs as giant fans or artificial trees? And this brings me to the other area in which the humanities can be very useful, and that is related to how we talk about CDR. As the example of the giant fans versus artificial trees so poignantly show, a significant aspect of talking about CDR is driven by creating analogies or metaphors which help us describe something new. We have to rely on what people know to describe what they do not know. That is both a challenge and an opportunity. We may frame technology in a way that negatively impacts its acceptance. The best example is the constraining taxonomy that employs a nature-technology dichotomy. Because tempering with nature is an extremely influential factor for public acceptance or non-acceptance of CDR, it was probably not helpful to differentiate between nature-based and engineered technologies. And we see this in the surveys that research gives us. So words matter. Do we frame CDR as a net zero technology or as climate intervention? Public support will change depending on what it thinks CDR is. Do we remove, scrub, or capture CO2 from the sky? If we capture, some segments of society may immediately associate CDR with CCUS, which leads to resistance. Do we store or sequester CO2? In different jurisdictions, storage also awakens associations with nuclear waste and hence instigating resistance. But let me come to my last point, and that is what can history contribute? And if we could move on to the next slide, please. And here we have a quote that you probably all know from the IPCC report from 2022, talking about the role of CDR, which can fulfill three different complementary roles: lowering net CO2 in the near term, counterbalancing hard to abate residual emissions in the midterm, and achieving net negative CO2 in the long term. Now, what history can contribute here is, first of all, don't forget, climate change is caused by what we did in the past. So understanding that part of the story might also be very useful as something that helps us understand what should be done now and looking into the future. And as we can see from the quote here, CDR plays out in different timelines: short, medium, and long term. Now, thus narrating CDR includes looking backward and looking forward, as well as employing different timelines. Now, this may all sound very simple and straightforward. However, temporal understanding is anything but simple, as most historians will tell you. So scientific models and generalizations in the social sciences, which are really important aspect of our work, especially in the context of social acceptance, are not always particularly good when it comes to integrating dynamic processes, change over time, and unintended consequences. Thus, a historically informed understanding of humanity might help guard against some of these pitfalls. And this is particularly important when talking about legacy CO2, as it seems to be the crucial aspect in explaining the importance of CDR as supplementing all the other mitigation strategies without raising the specter of moral hazard. It also brings to the fore, of course, intergenerational aspects of CDR deployment. So I encourage us, and that's part of the research that I do, to really bring language of history to understand the temporalities and maybe take away some of the fears and instill more hope. A historical perspective makes it then easier to comprehend CDR research and deployment as part of a process, which also includes monitoring after deployment and, in case of place-based technologies, potential remediation and reclamation. So finally, it allows us to address other temporal challenges of CDR, such as the long time horizons, the temporal discontinuity between actions today and their effects much later, which we know psychological creates a problem, and is a problem really in democracies where you have much shorter election cycles, as well as the temporal issue of paying financial costs in the present for future gains. All of this underlines particular understandings of time and history. It may also caution us to frequently use the metaphor of bridging technologies for technological timeframes. So these are just some of the ideas, and I hope you've seen how we can contribute in many ways to very important discussions, particularly around public or social acceptance. And I'll now pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Mack Penner, who will talk you through a very specific example using more history language to talk about some of these things that I've already mentioned.
Thanks, Petra. Thanks to all of you for being here. I won't dither-dather, I'll just get on with this. So again, while I am indeed a historian, and as Petra indicated, I will talk quite a bit today in historical terms, I guess I can't resist but to start with a bit of news from the almost exact present. So last week, within about the first hour after I had sat down to draft this talk, I got a news alert from the New York Times that spelled doom and gloom for the carbon dioxide removal. Carbon removal industry reels as Microsoft retreats, went the headline, above a subhead that noted CDR was just not really catching on. So the big problem, according to this reporting, was that Microsoft, the tech behemoth which, quote, almost single-handedly established the market for carbon dioxide removal technologies, end quote, was suddenly not so enthusiastic and was putting its investments in CDR on pause. A potted summary of the CDR industry's emergence over the past decade, and especially since the turn of the decade at 2020, concluded with the lament that demand for the host of technologies that fall under the CDR umbrella hasn't been forthcoming. And especially because of the Trump administration's near total disregard for combating climate change, indeed its insistence that climate change is not a real problem at all, recent years have been slow. So reduced carbon credit purchases, shrunken workforces at some companies, and uncertainty about the future of the industry. The article concluded by noting that the CDR industry had so far removed an utterly tiny fraction of the atmospheric carbon that it needs to do in order to deliver on its apparent promise. So now I raise this because it is a useful way to introduce what I guess is probably the key point of my remarks here. Carbon dioxide removal, whether we're talking about development or deployment or anything else, is not just a matter of technology. Indeed, scarcely anything that we think of as a technology is just that. CDR, like any other technology, is subject to social, economic, and political forces, and those forces are not just ancillary or operating at the edges of a mainly technological plotline, but instead, such dynamics are directly consequential for how and when and whether a given technology will ultimately have broad and meaningful uptake. So if I can convince you here that this is true, then these remarks will have been a success. Okay, so I'll now move into this fellow travelers section that you see on the slide here. So that introductory vignette that I just presented also introduces two important concepts that shape how we think about climate change generally and CDR more particularly, especially in the humanities. The first of these, I think probably the one you're more likely to have heard of, is techno-optimism. So techno-optimism is one important kind of political reaction or political position related to CDR and to climate change as well. Unsurprisingly, the promise of a technological fix for climate change prompts excitement in certain corners. And so perhaps the most widely known version of such techno-optimism is the self-declared one of the libertarian venture capitalist Marc Andreessen, whose techno-optimist manifesto, as it was called, poses technology as the ultimate solution to virtually all and any of our collective problems. Quote, give us a real world problem and we can invent technology that will solve it, he writes. On the real world problem of climate change, Andreessen considers the matter all but settled, forecasting unlimited, clean, that is low or no carbon energy for everyone in this technologically advanced future. So this version of techno-optimism is extreme, but to one degree or another, such views do have real purchase. Andreessen himself is known to be a right-wing ideologue, and so his techno-optimism is accordingly political in quite an obvious way. However, as the political theorist Alyssa Battistoni has written of techno-optimism more generally, it is frequently the case that the public gets, quote, the impression that meaningful decarbonization can take place only through technological innovation achieved via the closed-door haggling of regulators and industry, end quote. So in other words, politics and social attitudes can be ignored, creating a sense that technology alone can and will become an across-the-board solution. So this kind of attitude, I would submit, is lurking behind stories like that one that I opened with. CDR, at least sometimes, is treated as a technology in a vacuum or a non-political matter, and we can wind up in a situation where urgent and significant matters like the development and the scaling of CDR are subject to the whims and the preferences of an investor like Microsoft that is more or less entirely beyond democratic accountability. So techno-optimism, that is also a kind of techno-reliance. And there are serious pitfalls that lurk beyond that sort of reliance. Okay, so then the other and related concept that I want to introduce here is what is called overshoot ideology. This idea has been popularized especially by the work of a pair of radical climate scholars called Andreas Malm and Wim Carton, who see the current period in the history of climate change and climate politics as the overshoot conjuncture. Conjuncture here is like humanities speak for basically the whole constellation of dynamics that make a particular period in time. And so to speak of an overshoot conjuncture is to anoint overshoot as really the key feature of an era. And so overshoot then refers to the way in which established limits to global warming, 1.5 degrees, the most famous of those limits, are strolled up to and passed, often with scant alarm, as states and firms alike assure us all that, especially thanks to nascent technologies like CDR, the overshoot will eventually be reversible. This became especially prevalent in the years from 2018 to 2022, a period that began with the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which of course was the report that painted the picture of what warming of 1.5 degrees would mean and what the dangers were of trespassing beyond that perhaps arbitrary, but nevertheless significant threshold. So that 2018 IPCC report thus marked the beginning of the overshoot era in the sense that it established, or in the near years after the Paris Agreement affirmed, the boundary that could then be overshot. And so from there, almost immediately, as Mal and Carton stress in their version of this, the rush beyond the boundary began. Quote, what then transpired on the ground, they write of the report's aftermath, was a revving of the engine, end quote. And they also expect this kind of thing to recur. So first we'll go by 1.5 degrees, then maybe we'll go by 1 point something else, then 2. Quote, the logic of overshoot potentially reappearing at every identified limit. And so quite importantly, overshoot is a powerful force because its emergence represented what Malm and Carton describe as, quote, an alignment with the power of business as usual, meaning that it was an idea well matched to the ways of living and thinking and consuming that were responsible for warming the world in the first place. Malm and Carton, I think, mean this in the way that we might expect as a version of the quite familiar critique that CDR could enable overshoot to the extent that some of its proponents push the view that it will allow us to stabilize and even reduce global warming after the fact, even if we don't address climate change in other ways right now. But I think here that the relationship of CDR to business as usual is also evident in another way, which is, again, also apparent in that opening story. So the fortune of CDR seems, at least at times, to rise and fall on account of the technology's ability to fit into existing business models and political projects. So that is where that other critique that I just mentioned assumes that those interested in business as usual will embrace CDR head on, basically no matter what. This, I think, may not actually be the case. So when CDR fits well into existing models and projects, things can start to look pretty good. But when it doesn't, things can look bleak for the industry, or at least significant parts of it, pretty quickly. And of course, in the meantime, the Earth warms. So I'll now move into this brief, narrow, and Canadian historical episode. So far, I've indicated my big point here that CDR can't or shouldn't be seen just as a technology, and I've introduced these two concepts, techno-optimism and overshoot, to help advance the point. So I'm now going to switch into this more historical and indeed more Canadian register in order to give a concrete, not just speculative, account of how the dynamics that are named by these concepts have shaped the development of technology to reduce and remove atmospheric carbon. So several of you will know that much of my work for Cancor has involved research in the archives of the Imperial Oil Company, which is really an incredible historical resource housed at the University of Calgary. And some of you too will have already heard me talk about Imperial's efforts to investigate the prospects for removing carbon from the atmosphere in the early 1990s. But what I want to do here is to talk about those investigations in a somewhat different way, putting them into conversation, as it were, with these concepts of techno-optimism and overshoot. So skipping necessarily quite a bit of context, let's just jump right in here to March 1990, when Imperial published a discussion paper on what it referred to as just potential global warming. But whether they thought that the Earth was really warming or not, I think that we can probably pretty confidently assume that Imperial and other firms like it knew the reality of what was going on. Imperial vowed commitment to being helpful on the climate front and indicated several different priorities in their efforts to do so. One of their key commitments here was to fostering the development of new technology. And so on this technological front, Imperial's more precise commitment was, quote, to determine the technical and economic potential for carbon dioxide sinks or mechanisms to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, such as underground injection into oil-bearing reservoirs to support enhanced oil recovery operations, end quote. They investigated this potential by looking at Alberta, where at the time fossil fuel producers were directly responsible for about 42% of provincial emissions and 10% of national emissions, which of course made perfect sense given the industrial concentration in the province. Alberta basically was quite an appropriate place to look into this. And so as some of you will remember from hearing me talk about this previously, if we were to dig into the details here, we find that Imperial was ultimately not that enthused by the potential for carbon removal, at least in that particular context of 1990s Alberta. But still on the surface, their pitch here was, I think, decidedly techno-optimistic, as they repeatedly stressed how the immense technical expertise that was, I think, indubitably contained within the company could be directed to the development of new technologies and practices that would benefit the environment. This was a firm with, quote, extensive research capabilities and facilities, as well as the financial capacity to make major technological contributions. But as Imperial well understood, neither in the narrow case of carbon dioxide removal, nor in the sort of broader scope of the technologies that might serve the environment and combat climate change, was this a merely technological matter. Technology, again, is developed in particular social, political, and economic contexts. And in the 1990s here, Imperial saw those contexts as the major obstacle to the development of technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So if you like, in other words, the problem with CDR at this point was that it did not mesh well with business as usual. So how so? I have to be very brief here, but there are some key issues that I'll try to highlight. So first, Imperial was too Canadian, in a sense, by which I mean that it took a view that said Canada was too small, too minor, not important enough to do this kind of thing on its own. Quote, Canada has an important role to play as part of the world community in safeguarding and maintaining the environment around us, they claimed. But crucially, quoting again, this role cannot be decisive in terms of its impact on the global scene, end quote. And then, moreover, and whatever the means, so technological or otherwise, substantially reducing carbon emissions in the relatively near term here would have required, quote, significant changes in energy consumption patterns beyond those reasonably expected to be motivated by the workings of economic forces, and would likely require very significant intervention in the economic marketplace in Canada, end quote. So neither individual people nor the state were ready to basically do what it would take at this point, at least as Imperial saw it. And then finally, at least for the very brief version of this history that I'll get to in these remarks, there was an economic obstacle here. So if Canada was to pursue the combating of climate change too aggressively, it would put itself at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis other trading states in the world. In so doing, it might even inadvertently undercut its ability to protect the environment. So for Imperial itself, if it were to jump headlong into the development of a technology like CDR, it could encounter economic problems of its own. And as a result, the company insisted that carbon removal was only feasible if the financial and logistical burden was shared by various stakeholders, especially by government. So again, I've kind of rushed through this, but what Imperial was saying here was basically this. Technologies like CDR needed to be compatible with business as usual in order to be feasible. So this, I think, is very important for how we think about CDR in the era of the overshoot. If the most sort of cynical kind of concern here is that the promise of CDR permits continuing emissions beyond what we can actually sustain by allowing us to believe that one day it'll all be reversible, there is also, I think, another kind of concern very much worth entertaining. So leaving aside the question of whether CDR actually offers sort of cover for fossil business as usual, what if CDR is actually precariously dependent on its ability to fit into the very conduct of that business as usual? So I'll now wrap up here by moving to this final bit on my view from the humanities. Okay, so when we read a story about the problems caused by the reluctance of one company to continue with its investments in CDR, like the story that I opened with, and the ways in which changing political and economic realities contribute to that reluctance, what we are really reading is a story fundamentally about the way in which CDR is more than just a technology. It is, again, also a matter of political, economic, and social dynamics, and its success or failure is in part dependent on those dynamics. So after all, no one that I'm aware of, certainly not the IPCC, takes the view that the successful trajectory for CDR is the one in which the technology becomes so powerful and so widespread that it single-handedly solves our great collective carbon problem. Instead, the success trajectory is the one in which CDR, alongside a suite of other changes in everything from policy to infrastructure and even to individual behavior, plays a helpful role in reducing the carbon in the atmosphere to the point that we can keep the heat down. And so for all of that to happen, anyone committed to slowing climate change and who thinks that CDR can play a part in the reaching of that broad objective, this, I imagine, might describe literally everyone here, needs to ask themselves, can we afford to leave the development and the deployment of CDR technology blowing in the inconsistent winds of today's business as usual? And if the answer is no, as I maybe risk some grandiosity here, then the historical mission of that coalition that I just described, everyone who cares about CDR because they care about climate change, is to force changes to business as usual and to do it, hopefully, quickly. Doing that will be many things, I'm sure, but perhaps most of all, it will be a matter of politics. Not in the narrow sense of a politics of CDR, but a more general climate politics that insists on addressing the climate crisis, even amid countless other geopolitical crises, and thus creates the conditions of possibility for CDR to play its role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petra. Dr. Mack? We are gonna go on to our Q&A section, but that was very interesting. Thank you. This really is a great example of the cross-disciplinary collaboration that the Cancer Initiative have, and where you were talking about the importance of having all the stakeholders involved in the development of CDR. I found particularly interesting that and the importance of language, especially in this industry where everybody refers to different things in different terms, and which is common in a nascent industry. But okay, so for the questions, let me see if we have any questions on the Q&A or on the chat. If not, I'm gonna start with the questions that we gathered on the registration link. And while the attendees get rolling on those questions in here. Okay, so Dr. Mack and Dr. Petra, what will be the socioeconomic constraints and trade-offs when evaluating CDR and decarbonization policy?
If I will go first, and I'm sure Mac also has something to say about this. It, it's almost, we are even before that kind of question. So yes, it will be extremely important for us to understand what are some of the, social challenges to it. But I don't think even we are at the stage where we know how to talk to people about how they would perceive certain things to pose problems or not. So that would be one thing that, first of all, we also need to find ways of engaging with potentially those who are affected. And that part also means that we cannot just go to so-called stakeholders. I think part of the problem for some of the researchers who look into social or public acceptance, and they use social or public acceptance and at stakeholders, is that researchers in this area can, in sort of CDR and other net zero technologies, very often already have in their mind who the affected parties are and who are the groups that really need to be consulted, which is encapsulated in this idea of stakeholders. So we know, or we think we know, who all holds a stake in this. And I think part of the problem that the research has shown to us is that we need to go bigger. We need, with the nascent technology, we need to actually maybe question even our understanding of who the stakeholders are and go broader and really try and sort of ascertain what much broader community societies think about this, citizens and so on and so forth. Beyond that, of course, it is very specific also to the type of CDR technology. So there's a lot of research, particularly in the UK, that looks into any sort of land-based CDR form, which means that you need to talk to people on the ground. And so this is where we do know that there are certain fears that have to do with the way that it impacts the sense of place. And as most of the research says, like the biggest factors that will help us understand societal acceptance are trust, knowledge, perceived benefits, perceived risks, but very, very strongly, the tempering with nature. That is something that we already see. And hence my call or caution of how you sort of present certain aspects of the technology as more or closer to nature or more engineered. But yes, I think for me, the issue is more, are we even at the stage where we can do all the research that we need to do in order to establish what are the things that society is worrying about? And that was a very long-winded answer, but I'll pass it on to Mack, who may have some other thoughts here.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. The way that I was going to put this is that I think at some level it is worth thinking of everyone as a stakeholder. And it goes to my point about the importance of this broader climate politics here, which, for a variety of reasons, war, crises of affordability, security concerns, whatever, on down the list, we in the last couple of years, you don't hear quite so much about climate change, climate crisis, so on and so forth. But to the point about everyone being a stakeholder, it seems to me that the reason to care about CDR is because you care about climate change. Maybe there are some people in the room who can access such like technologically interesting aspects of this that you could be sort of interested in those terms. But for the population broadly, the reason to care about CDR is because you care about climate change. So I think it's just sort of essential that somehow, some way, this sense of the climate crisis and the need to do something about it is sort of maintained in the public's political imagination, as it were.
All right. Thank you, guys. I guess with that, we're also answering the question on what would be the optimal stakeholder engagement from the humanities perspective. But Dr. Petra, you mentioned benefits, trust, knowledge as the items that will increase social acceptance. Will that translate? Will that mean long-term demand drivers? Could those be classified as long-term demand drivers, or what will be those from the humanities perspective? What will drive long-term demand?
I mean, that I find very, very difficult to sort of establish, and this is where I think that's where we need that kind of inter-transdisciplinary approach, where we bring in what the economists tell us, what even behavioral psychology tells us in terms of individual behavior, but also what sociologists, anthropologists, and so on tell us. But to come back to the first part of that question, like what would best engagement look like, I think is something that we do here at the University of Calgary in terms of transdisciplinary research, which is we don't just, sort of do our research, wait, and then go out and hope for some social license and present sort of what's there in terms of deployment, but we try and engage with anyone while we are doing our research. I think that for me is the best way of engaging everyone as a stakeholder or society at large, that we need to find ways to do this from the beginning, but also to not do this in a unidirectional way. Everyone has some sort of knowledge in this conversation. And the idea that we are the ones who bring the knowledge to the table and then we see how the community reacts to this, that is only one piece of what our research entails. It is equally about meeting on the same level in terms of sharing different knowledges. We have seen, like I mentioned, these UK studies where, you talk to people, farmers on the ground, they know a lot and a lot more than we may do about the locality. And so if you ask me, what does best engagement look like, is many different ways of engaging, but always understanding that this is on an equal level where we share certain knowledges and do this in an iterative process, right? I think this is what all the failures of other technologies in the past have shown us, where engineers find the solution to a societal challenge and then are surprised when society says, we don't want this. Because society is not a rational actor. It might be, informed by long-held fears, by certain ways of framing something. And so this is what needs to change.
All right. We got a couple of questions. I'm going to try to combine some of these. But okay, as you were talking about how society perceives these technologies, and we have the examples from historical times. How about nowadays, like and currently, okay, have you noticed any political societal challenges? And do you think that the society nowadays, the contemporary society, has the patience for the slow change?
Yeah, just brief remarks on this, trying to think about this question from the vantage of like the history of the, let's say, the second half of the 20th century into the 21st. So it seems to me that this is more or less a global phenomenon, but if we just sort of restrict ourselves to thinking about North America, this certainly holds true. That from the second half of the 20th century, so like the period right after the Second World War to the present, for a very long time, we held on to a kind of binary in terms of how we would think about these things. Either markets do things or states do things. And that binary shaped so much thinking and action over a swath of historical time that was 70 some odd years in duration. What I think we see at times now is, let's say, a certain interruption to that binary, where the new wrinkle is states, like the one in the United States right now, basically deciding unilaterally to sort of tell markets, as it were, that even if you wanted to do this, we won't let you. Um, so it's not just a matter of sort of like placing the burden on one side or another, but in fact, one side of that binary basically clobbering the binary and forcing all of this upheaval that I think we encounter every day as like what is going on with business as usual. You used to be able to sort of like assume some stability there, and that doesn't seem to be true so much anymore. And that lack of stability, I think, is one of the major problems for CDR these days.
And I would add to that the question about slow versus fast change. This is why it's so important to understand technology also as a social space, because what you actually notice is that some of these things are out of sync, where the technology might change very, very fast, but actually the social, embedding of it is not keeping pace with it. So this is something I think that we see with AI. And so that also contributes to the ruptures that Mac mentions there. And this is why it is so important for us to recognize that these, technologies are always more than it, and that can create the disjunct, for example, between the pace that we see there. And also in terms of the question of, system level deployment, have we seen new things? And this is where there are now studies that really do a comparison of social acceptance of CDR, comparing, for example, different countries in the global south and global north. And what they have interestingly added to our understanding of that social piece is that generational aspect. It really teased out how younger generation endorses CDR more on a very general kind of level than older generations. But also on a systemic level, it really matters whether you differentiate between, geoengineering. That's one to answer maybe the third question. I think the geoengineering did not help CDR. Geoengineering as, encompassing both solar radiation management and CDR, that was really not useful because it very quickly led to a lot of opposition, because it has this idea of, we are sort of tampering with the whole blue planet now. And those are the kind of things that we see there. So it's a good question. I think we are now seeing a lot more higher level understandings of the factors that go beyond the community, but that differ from country to country. And this is where history again is important, because it helps you understand why there might be certain cultures around. Like, I'm from Germany, I can tell you, putting things in the ground always creates a discussion that really creates a lot more opposition than anything else.
Yeah, if I could, I'll just sort of jump in on that question about like words to be avoided, and answer it maybe in sort of a general kind of way. This is a place where I think context can be so important. And the question of like what do you actually want to do in a conversation that you might be having with some hypothetical person about CDR, climate change, whatever. And I think we should ask ourselves, is the purpose of this conversation, really ambitious to change a mind, to sort of, lay out in the most honest sort of way what we might think about something? Or are you sort of trying to meet people where they are? And in that sense, have sort of perhaps smoother type of conversation. Naturally, I think that the perfect balance is to start by meeting people where they are, and from there sort of move towards changing minds. But I think just that general point of the context in which you encounter these conversations being particularly important in terms of informing what words might be trigger words or not. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Very important context. Words might, bring different sentiment in different people depending on where they are or their generation. So thank you for bringing that up. And then maybe the last question to sort of wrap up. They and maybe briefly you can describe the role of carbon removal politics in helping maintaining the net zero targets in times of climate backsliding.
My point here would be think broader than carbon removal politics. It's just very difficult for me to sort of, imagine the century from here. So into what would that be, 21, 26 or something like this. Difficult to imagine CDR kind of remaining on the political technical table over the course of that period in the absence of a more general kind of climate politics also remaining on the table. So I think the durability of these kinds of projects really depends to quite a significant extent on the durability of climate politics and the ability of people who are, say, interested in CDR to sort of recognize that in some way that makes you a climate politics person more generally, and to sort of act and think accordingly.
And I would add to that, do not just look at the content of that policy and sort of that and hope that that will support this, but look at the process of arriving at that policy. So legitimacy, fairness, these are all the things that we hear on the ground when you talk to people who might be impacted on it. And it's not that people are willing to pay a price for something that will help the collective, right? Like one of the things that we really also need to understand is this coming together of the higher level issue, right? A global or national common good, the greater good, and the local sense of burden. So I think for me, it's more important, do we also arrive at policies following a process that really ensures that everyone feels that they are heard, that they're included in this, and that there is at least a balance in terms of, it's not that people are not willing to take a burden, but you need to also show, and this is why Mack, of course, makes the point, you can only show that if you combine that with larger climate goals. And that kind of allows you to combine the higher level common good with whatever will happen on the ground in a particular community. But that has more to do with the process of arriving at a policy than the actual content of that policy.
Okay, perfect. I think this is a very interesting conversation, and it's interesting to look also what has happened through history. So thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you all for joining. We'll be sending you the recording of the session, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Please keep in touch on new webinars that will be coming up in the next following months, and see the great work that we do at the Cancer Initiative. Thank you very much. Have a great day.